Good morning, everyone. Buenos días. Espero que estén muy bien. All right. The arts produced in Latin America and the Caribbean during the 19th century have traditionally been studied as part of an intermediate period between the colonial culture and the modern art of the 20th century, as well as the result of the political, economic, and sociocultural transformations of a sort of transitional century, which is very common in 19th century art from Latin America, or the approach from historiography. In this sense, art historiography has focused on the survival and transformation of the hegemonic European-based colonial aesthetics, the modernization, Europeization of urban culture, and the birth of the so-called truly national art in the states formed after independences. That's during the 19th century and the early 20th century, with landscape and rural, many things that are common and characteristics from Latin American art. A promising century for the colonized territories that began with the Haitian Revolution and was characterized by the rise of liberalism and the dreams of freedom that fueled the independences of most of the American territories, was still a century in which the dispossession of lands, the colonization, and genocide of indigenous peoples increased, now under the names of progress and modernity. This becomes evident when we review the historiography of 19th century Central American art and realize a generalized exclusion of the arts produced by the indigenous communities and their own historical narratives, which do not always coincide with the history written by the criollos and their descendants. How to rethink historical narratives about 19th century Latin American and Caribbean art by incorporating indigenous historical narratives and material culture in art history studies about this period? I will examine a set of objects related to the Totonicapán uprising of 1820, now Guatemala, and their importance for the contemporary historical narrative underlying the communal government or the Council of the 48 Cantons of Totonicapán, el Consejo de los 48 Cantones, of these Maya Quiché territories. Inspired by the Ananda Cohen Aponte work on visual culture and archives associated with indigenous revolts, as well as the notion of visual sovereignty theorized by Jolene K. Ricard, this paper questions the vice-regal and republican narratives and theoretical apparatuses that have made these objects of material culture are as invisible as are the historical narratives of the Quiché people in the historiography of 19th century Central America. Of course, this applies to many other cases, right? This is just a study case for a broader reflection that I'm having. I'm a third-year PhD student in history of art, majoring in the field of Latin American art, with minors in Native American art and indigenous studies and Latin American history. As you said before, my dissertation is about 19th century visual identities, especially focusing in indigenous communities from Central America. Cases from the north, the east, and the south of Central America, namely Totonicapán, the Mosquito Kingdom and the Caribbean, and Talamanca in the Bribri area of Costa Rica, as well as the relationship of those communities with European colonial empires and the nation state. I'm currently working on my doctoral comprehensive exam, so any feedback you can give me will be welcome for me. This is very important. So this is like the geographical scope of my research, and which is important to mention is that during the 19th century there were many changes in the borders and like in the political structures that we had in Central America, different projects. I'm going to mention that later today. So this is a question that I already talked to you. So even though Latin American countries are essentially multi-ethnic communities, there are still many racist structures that have been common in academia and cultural institutions. Historically, indigenous and Afro-descendant communities have been the ethnic groups most discriminated and excluded from the white Criollo identities that are the basis of most nation-state projects in Latin American countries. According to this racist point of view, indigenous peoples are usually imagined in the past or as primitive peoples who impede progress, and Afro-descendants are always associated with the Caribbean and a series of racist stereotypes. Of course, there are many differences in this, but this is like a it's generalized. However, this does not mean that these cultural identities are totally ignored by the settler states, since at different historical moments, the Latin American republics have incorporated symbols referring to these ethnic groups into their national imaginary, and museums have collected many objects from the indigenous communities, but for different purposes, of course, more like ethnographic, archaeological, and placing indigenous peoples like in the past or in museums, basically. As we all know, art history is a discipline of European origin, and therefore its foundations were built with European art as the theoretical and stylistic standard to evaluate all the artistic manifestations of the world. This traditional history of art is based on a narrative about how ancient European art reached beauty with classical antiquity, how it degenerated in the Middle Ages, and how it resurfaced in the Renaissance, and then dominated until the late 19th century when another European genius, the modern art, revolutionized universal art. This interpretation of history is Eurocentric and was reinforced during the centuries of colonialism through the project of Westernization of the North-European societies, including the Americas. For this reason, evaluations such as bad imitation, little technical capacity, archaism, anachronism, or little artistic merit are common in more traditional studies on the visual art produced under European colonialism and during early Republican times in Latin America and the Caribbean. Focusing in Central American scenario, the professionalization of art history in Central America is a process that began in the mid-20th century and continues today. Costa Rica and Guatemala are the two countries with more active art historians and therefore academic publications. Why these countries? On the one hand, due to the large art collection preserved in Guatemala and the early participation of international scholars, which has produced a long tradition of publications on Guatemalan colonial architecture and art. On the other hand, the art history undergraduate program at the Universidad de Costa Rica, established in 1970, has trained dozens of art historians, most of them specialized in modern and contemporary Costa Rican art. This is the only program in Central America that teaches art history, at least until today. There has been other programs, but they are ephemeral, especially in Guatemala. Right now, they're closed. The Congress, however, the scope of research on both academic communities has been too nationalistic, and unfortunately, they have operated in isolation. We have been operating in isolation. The Congress of Central American History has been a unique international space where we have gathered, but this is a conference dominated by historians, where only a small group of art historians participate regularly. So it's something that is building right now, but it's complex. In general terms, the historiography of Central American art has studied the art produced under colonization from the point of view of the Spanish or global Baroque art. The most critical positions come from Marxist perspective, but in most cases, these studies come from history and anthropology, not art history. In the case of the study of 19th century art, the situation is similar, but perhaps more problematic, because very few scholars have worked on the arts of this century, 19th century, which is located precisely between the two main focuses of Central American historiography, viceregal art or colonial art and modern art. Therefore, there are not many academic publications, and the most important ones are from decades ago. So I think it is necessary to rethink 19th century art and material culture in the context of current debates about colonialism and visual sovereignty, which are crucial to understand other things that happened, and they didn't write about that. In the case of the historiography of Guatemalan art, which is the focus of this presentation, and Totonicapán, Víctor Miguel Díaz's book, Las Bellas Artes en Guatemala, published in 1934, stands out as an early example of the traditional narrative of Guatemalan art. As its title indicates, the text focuses on Bellas Artes or fine arts, thus relegating indigenous material culture to antiquities or popular traditions. In the same way, volumes 3 and 4 of the important collection Historia General de Guatemala, published in 2005, have selections dedicated to the study of the visual arts and architecture of 19th century, in which mentions of indigenous art are marginal, while cases studies are predominantly related to the imprint of European styles in the art produced in Guatemala under colonization and during the early Republican times. This vision coincides with the curatorial line of the National Museum of Guatemalan History, the National Museum of Colonial Art in La Antigua Guatemala, and other important museums across Central America. It's not exclusively from this country. In this paper, I examine a set of images produced in Guatemala under colonization and early Republican times, in which either indigenous artists and patrons participated, or the indigenous are represented as part of a historical and identity narrative of the settler state. My focus is on the objects used by the Quiché of Totonicapán during and after the 1820 revolt against the Spanish. I believe that the critical study or incorporation of these images is essential to rethink the nationalist narrative that have made up the traditional canon of Central American art history, and to unlearn this biased, Eurocentric, and formalist approach to art produced under colonization and in this post-colonial state of the early 19th century. I will focus my analysis on the case of the Quiché community of Totonicapán and the role of Chronodissidence for the defense of their authority and communal sovereignty through political actions, the use of material culture, and the preservation of their historical narratives. The Quiché are a Maya ethnic group whose origins date back to the early Mesoamerican post-classic period and who have historically inhabited the western highlands of the Central American territories currently known as Guatemala. At the time of the Spanish invasion of America, the Quiché were in conflict with the Cachiqueles, another Maya group, with whom they disputed hegemony over their areas of influence. And then the Tlaxcaltecas came with Pedro Alvarado, and many things happened. The history of the Quiché people survived the devastation brought by the conquistadors, including the Tlaxcaltecas, through oral tradition and two written documents. El Título de Totonicapán, written in 1554, by the Yash clan, and the Popol Vuh, reading in the early 18th century in Santo Tomás Chichicastenango. These are manuscripts from the 16th and 18th centuries, but they're probably based on ancient pre-Hispanic documents, which are considered proofs of their sovereignty over the territories in which they have inhabited since then. Remember that the Popol Vuh is the book of the Quiché. It's not about all the Maya ethnicities. There are a lot of Maya ethnicities. This is really about the Quiché. That's political, and that's meaningful. And it's worth to mention that. Título de Totonicapán is about Totonicapán, which was a very important lineage of this Quiché royalty. Using these concepts, of course, is different, but they were a lineage, right? Through the convulsive 19th century, the indigenous communal authorities of Totonicapán resisted the systematic attempts of the Spanish colonial and Guatemalan Republican governments to steal all their communal lands and invalidate the power of their local indigenous authorities, las alcaldías indígenas. The rising led by Atanasio Tzul and Lucas Aguilar in 1820 marked a watershed for the peoples of Totonicapán and is considered a founding moment of the Council of the 48 Cantons of Totonicapán, the indigenous communal organization that governs all these Quiché territories until today. After the independence of 1821, the rulers of Totonicapán had to deal with different political organizations such as the Mexican Empire, the Federal Republic of Central America, the State of Guatemala, the State of Los Altos, and the Republic of Guatemala. All these political structures existed during the 19th century, briefly or during more time, but there were many changes in this area of Los Altos or the highlands of Guatemala. It's interesting to mention that they had a better relationship with the conservative presidents than with the liberal politicians, but always maintaining their defense of the Quiché sovereignty, because the liberals, I think you mentioned yesterday, they were very interested in taking all of those land and to liberalize everything, so the conservatives were more close to the manners of the Spanish crown, that they recognize, at least the Spanish crown, a lot of independence for some indigenous communities, but the liberal state, they didn't recognize that at all. So that changed many things. However, Totonicapán is one of these examples of peoples that resisted those processes, and we want to delve on this. The rebellions of indigenous peoples in the Americas under Spanish rule were a historical process that marked the formation of the political and cultural identities of many contemporary indigenous communities. The cases of the Pueblo Revolt in North America and the insurgent movement led by Tupac Amaru in South America are paradigmatic cases for the study of indigenous rebellions of the colonial era. In both cases, Pueblo, Tupac Amaru, material culture and cultural exchange play a fundamental role in the insurgent struggle of the peoples who rebelled against the Spanish royal and ecclesiastical authorities. The insurgent group destroyed some Christian religious images and symbols of Hispanic monarchical authority, but they also appropriated some of these objects to visually represent their authority in public spaces. However, once the Spanish regained control of these territories, they tried to erase or manipulate the memory of the events to reinforce colonial domination over those populations. The dispute between the memory of the indigenous people and the official history of the Spanish criollos and their descendants lasted until the Republican era and continues to be a relevant issue today. For example, you know, they did this in New Mexico about La Virgen Conquistadora after they retake these territories. Santa Fe and all of those territories, and this is very, problematic. But it's like a tradition now to remember this submission, apparent submission. Similar conflicts occurred in Central America during those centuries, and probably the most important one was the Setzal rebellion of Los Endales in the early 18th century, 1712. They took control of a big portion of Chiapas, this Maya community, during 6 months, and it was like a big issue, a big problem for the Spanish conquistadors. Then they retook control of these territories, but that was like probably the biggest rebellion in 18th century Central America, and that established like a trauma for the conquistadors. And then you have in the early 19th century the Haitian Revolution, and you have also before that the Tupac Amaru processes, and of course El Grito de Dolores in Mexico. So in the early 19th century, the settlers and criollos were very worried about the things that were happening. So they were trying to to represent their dominance over them. So this is just to show that it was like a broader process with different rebellions happening during these years. These are some of the images made by the settlers representing on the left. This is from Nicaragua. On the right is from Guatemala, Granada, Nicaragua. Nueva Guatemala de la Asunción on the right. And these are depictions, engravings of course, but representing performances and situations that happened in the odes to the kings, Charles IV on the left and Fernando VII on the right, where they depicted indigenous peoples with very stereotypical and racist approaches to this. And these are the images that we usually study the most in 19th century because they were made by these first engravers and drawers and criollos, right? So these images were used also during the 19th century to represent indigeneity. As you can see in this fountain that doesn't exist anymore, but was in the myth of Totonicapán, depicting the Guatemala Quiché, probably based in these engravings that is a personification of Guatemala Quiché. And on the right, you have the dictator Justo Rufino Barrios, depicted next to the Indian of Liberty, as they call that. And on the right, you have this statue that is still in Guatemala City, depicting Bartolomé de las Casas with an indigenous person kneeling. And that image was originally in front of schools for indigenous people in the late 19th century Guatemala. So these images are still around there in different spaces. So now let's focus and let's start closing this presentation. So in April the 2nd, 1820, in the Plaza San Miguel Totonicapán, Lucas Aguilar and other indigenous leaders publicly read a letter from 1812 in which members of the Confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament, Sagrado Sacramento, including Aguilar and Atanasio Tzul, the leader, thank Fernando VII for eliminating the royal tributes. This was in the context of las Cortes de Cádiz and the reformations that were happening there. So, as you may know, Fernando VII was like in prison, so José Bonaparte took the power, and in this lack of power, the colonies claimed that they were with Fernando VII. So, with the Court of Cádiz eliminate the taxes and Fernando VII returned, he reestablished the taxes. So, like in all this confusion, the indigenous leaders of this revolt, they used rumors in order to mobilize the people. And that was common in many other parts of Latin America. For example, in Venezuela, in the rebellion of Coro in 1795, this was the case again, like the rumors. And also in the Sendales, that was one of the strategies that they used to mobilize people. So they literally broke the constitution, but the meetings and the discourses were like in Quiché, because there are like 98% of the population, there are Maya Quiché people in Totonicapán, so that was like the language. But since today, the Ladinos are the one that control the local government, so it's like very complex. They have like two different authorities in the country, in the territory, and this is like the origin of that. So what happened? They revolt. They expelled the people that was against the revolt. Atanasio Tzul, according to the chronicles, because of course we don't have a lot of images about that, because they destroyed everything in order to erase that. He used the clothes of in the Spanish manner. He went into the horse. They performed bullfights. He crowned himself with the crown of San Joseph, and he crowned his wife with the crown of Santa Cecilia. And they use these royal staffs that are silver made, which are very common from these indigenous local authorities. And that's the throne that Atanasio Tzul used. And there were other thrones or chairs, wooden chairs. This chair was stolen in some moment of the 19th century by the Guatemalan state and was appropriated by the National Museum, and it was part of the Central American exhibition of 1887. Why? Representing an early hero of the Guatemalan independence. And that's narrative, what started in the 19th century by the national state, of course, but this is a narrative that academia does not support, that the Totonicapán people does not support at all. I mean, they don't recognize the independence of 1821. That's the official position of Totonicapán. They know and they proclaim that they are still under colonial dominion of the Ladino people. But according to the national state, they state that Atanasio Tzul is a prócer de la independencia, which is very complex to approach. So finishing with this, I'm going to finish with these images of San Miguel Arcángel, because the two images in the center are not in Totonicapán, but everyone knows that these images were in Totonicapán, and they were stolen in the context of the burning of the cathedral in 1878. Even the Catholic Church, they have spoken about this publicly, but they still have that in hotels and in a fancy museum in a university. So I think that probably not working about these art pieces probably related to these processes of looting and, dispossession of objects that are still sacred for them, because as you can see in the two images in the center and the one in the right, they are holding the scepter of rule that is common from the iconography of the rulers of these and the indigenous ancestral authorities, and is not part of the iconography of San Miguel. San Miguel tiene la balanza y la espada. That's the way that you depict San Miguel usually, and you can switch that. But in this case, it's very clear, and the presence of the feathers and also the Maya textiles. And with the final image, that is the ending of my presentation, this is the meeting room of Los 48 Cantones de Totonicapán, and 2 years ago, they managed a way to repatriate the throne, in which was involved Benvenuto Chavajay. He was part of this process as an activist, right? And in the center, they have this San Miguel, and the book that you see at his feet, that is a facsimile of El Título de Totonicapán, this colonial manuscript that proves their sovereignty over these territories. They have been collecting silver objects and this kind of sacred objects from them that are definitely related to this idea of visual sovereignty. So, to end, I think that all these things are important questions to make, and many of this information and many things, you can only know this talking to them, because this is oral history. There are many things that are not written, and there are different versions of history. So now I've been, dealing with this and trying to learn from and how to approach with oral history, which sometimes is not very common in 19th century art. So yes, that's basically my presentation. Thank you very much.